All right, welcome back. We're going to talk about the argument from contingency today, and this is our last week on the cosmological argument. So this is the second version of the cosmological argument we've discussed. This version trades on a distinction between contingent beings and necessary beings, and then it also depends, importantly, on a principle, the principle of sufficient reason. So before we set up the argument, we'll just review those definitions. What does it mean for a being to exist contingently, or what is a contingent being? Intuitively, the idea is a contingent being is one that actually exists, but might not have. And the might not have is a matter of possibility. It's something that exists, but had the world gone differently, it needn't have existed. We're going to put it this way, more technically, and this is the definition you should know. A contingent being is a being that actually exists, but possibly does not exist. For example, the NATO alliance, right? An alliance of Western, I believe all Western countries actually exists. But it didn't have to. It was formed after World War II in the sort of global and international reordering that occurred immediately after World War II. Had World War II gone differently, for example, had Germany won, probably there would have been no NATO. Had that been the way the world had gone, NATO wouldn't have existed. So in this sense, NATO is a contingent being. Exists, but didn't have to. By contrast, a necessary being we're going to understand as if there is such a being, right? And as we're going to see, part of the whole point of the argument from contingency is to argue that there is such a being, but we can make sense of the idea without presupposing that it exists. The idea of a necessary being is the idea of a being that actually exists, but would have existed no matter what, or couldn't have failed to exist. So if there is a necessary being, then not only does it exist, but had the Germans won World War II, it still would have existed. Had NATO not existed, it still would have existed. Had you and I not existed, this necessary being still would have been there. For anything we see around us, pretty much everything that we can identify seems to be contingent. If there is a necessary being, though, regardless of whether any of those or all of those contingent beings exist, the necessary being is still there. So a necessary being is a being that actually exists but does not possibly not exist, or it's impossible for it to not exist. I didn't assign this reading to you, but I may put it up as optional. This is a passage from the philosopher Leibniz, and this is his presentation of the argument. I'm putting the passage up here to highlight for you the principle of sufficient reason in particular. I'm not going to read the whole thing, just this highlighted part. He says, this is Leibniz, whatever exists has a cause, a reason, a ground of its existence, a foundation on which its existence relies, a ground or reason why it does exist rather than not, either in the necessity of its own nature, and then it must have been itself eternal, or in the will of some other being, and then that other being must, in the order of nature and causality, have existed before it. A couple of things to note here. We're going to be extracting the PSR from Leibniz, clarifying it a bit and putting it into modern terminology. Leibniz here seems to be suggesting that something could exist in virtue of the necessity of its own nature. This kind of comes close to what Rowe calls a self-caused or self-existent being. I'm going to kind of sidestep that idea because I think it needlessly complicates the argument. And instead, we're going to focus on this bit where he says, whatever exists has a cause, reason, or ground of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature, we're going to put that aside, or in the will of some other being. And by will there, he doesn't mean necessarily like agency. So it doesn't have to be that, the builders of the house are getting together and willing through their intentional planning that the house come into existence. That counts for him, but that's not the only thing he means. Unintentional bringing about of a contingent being also counts as causation. And this, of course, occurs in natural processes, right? Like the mountains formed. Even if you're a theist, you don't have to say that the mountains formed because God planned each and every mountain, although you may say that. But, the standard view is that there are non-intentional, non-willing natural processes that give rise to many of the things we see in the natural world. In any case, this is a statement of the PSR. Every being has a cause or explanation of its existence. And what's important here is that because contingent beings didn't have to exist, Leibniz is drawing our attention to the fact that it feels like there has to be something outside of a contingent being that could make it exist, given that it didn't have to. And that's the intuition that is captured by our formulation of the PSR. Every contingent being is caused to exist by something outside of itself. Notice that this version of the PSR doesn't say that everything has a cause, and we're going to circle back to this once we've gotten through the argument. So the cosmological argument from contingency itself, pretty straightforward. CAC, we can call it. Either every being is contingent, or there is a necessary being, CAC1. Not every being is contingent, or it's not the case that everything there is contingent. So there's only one other option. There is a necessary being. That's the conclusion of the argument. Now, is this valid? Really quickly, clearly it's valid. It has the following form, either P or Q, not P, therefore Q. So this is a kind of process of elimination argument that, as we've already seen, is logically valid. So the key question now is, given that it's valid, is it sound? Are its premises true? The first premise, as I discussed in class, we're not really going to talk much about. It is sort of trivially true by definition. The most important premise, and the one that is controversial, is the second premise. Why think that not every being is contingent? That seems like something that requires a defense. And indeed, the defender of the argument from contingency has an interesting defense to give us of that claim. So you can think of this as another argument, where this argument is a sub-argument that has as its conclusion the second premise of the original argument. So as we go, often what you'll find is that it's sort of arguments all the way down, right? And the hope is that you can keep whittling down with your discussion partner if you're having a debate over a philosophical topic, and they're not convinced by one of your premises, that you can say things, you can say additional premises, you can give additional arguments for the conclusion that that premise is true. And if in the course of saying those things you say something that they think is controversial, the hope is that you'll be able to say more things and give another argument for that sub-premise. And eventually the hope is you'll be able to get down to a place where the only premises you're relying on are things that everyone can agree to. And if your reasoning is valid, then you should be able to get them back up to the agree to the premises of your original argument and therefore your conclusion. It doesn't always happen that way, but that's the goal. All right. So we're giving a defense of the claim that not every being is contingent, and the defense starts with the following: let collection C be the complete collection of every contingent being that exists, has ever existed, or ever will exist. So graphically, I've got this represented over here with this little picture. Of course, in my little set, we've just got a horse, a city, an atom, a cell, a planet, a person, and Earth. And there's going to be a lot more in collection C, because collection C critically contains every single contingent being that ever existed, does exist, or ever will exist. Most likely, we're not going to be able to in any way given our finite lifespans, graphically represent all of the things within collection C. But the thought is that just as we can refer to numbers so large that we can't sort of fit them inside of our brain, we can still refer to them and work with them in mathematics. Likewise, we can refer to all of the contingent things there are, and that's all we're doing in 2.1. 2.2 says collection C is itself a contingent being. Why think this? Well, remember, everything within collection C is contingent. Now, all by itself, that doesn't automatically show us that the whole must be contingent, because we know that sometimes the properties of a whole are inherited from its parts, and sometimes they're not, right? The shape of a table is not inherited by, a table doesn't inherit its shape properties from the individual shape properties of its constituent parts. Neither does it inherit if each of its microphysical parts weighs less than a gram. It doesn't follow that the table weighs less than a gram. Of course not, because mass is additive. So sometimes some properties don't trickle upwards to the whole. And the question is whether contingency is like that. And here's the reason to think that maybe it is. Look, if you take away each and every one of the contingent beings in collection C, that is, you consider the possibility in which Earth doesn't exist, I don't exist, one by one, eventually you're going to get to a possibility in which none of the things in the collection exists. Now, can collection C exist if none of the things in the collection exist? Well, no. It's made up of those things. So maybe you can remove one or two, and in some sense the collection will be the same one. But certainly if there's a world in which none of the individual contingent things in C exist, in that world neither does collection C exist either. And if collection C doesn't exist in that possible world, then we know that collection C actually exists but possibly doesn't. So collection C is contingent. It's kind of a reason to think that the contingency of the parts in this case does indeed trickle upward to the whole. Yeah, there you go. It's contingent. PSR, if indeed collection C is contingent, then here's the PSR kicks in and says, well, every contingent thing has a cause outside of itself. Given that collection C is contingent, it follows that collection C has a cause outside of itself. So here we've got this represented with a little arrow and a question mark, because we don't really know what this is yet. All we know is there is a cause outside of collection C. Now, it followed from 2.4, and this move is quick, and I would want you to explain why I'm making this move, or why you're making this move on a test, for example. 2.5, therefore there is a being that is not contingent. Well, where's that coming from? Well, remember, collection C, by hypothesis, is the collection of every contingent thing there is. So anything outside the collection, by definition, must itself not be contingent. Because if it were contingent, it would be in the collection, but it's not, so it's not contingent. That's why we can conclude, once we know there's something outside the collection, that it's not contingent. There's a not contingent thing that causes the entire collection to exist. Looks like 2.6 may be cut off there, sorry about that, but 2.6 just says, therefore, not every being is contingent, which is the same thing as CAC2. So once you have there is a being that is not contingent, another way of putting that is that the second premise is true. Not every being is contingent.